The medieval age was not the Dark Ages as once believed, but a time of remarkable transformation. Great cathedrals reached toward heaven, universities sparked intellectual revival, and new forms of art and literature flourished across Europe. This era, spanning roughly from the 5th to the 15th century, would reshape the continent and lay the foundations for the modern world we know today. The fall of the Western Roman Empire. The year 476 AD marks a pivotal moment in European history. The last Western Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed by the Germanic chieftain Odoacer. This event traditionally marks the end of the Western Roman Empire and the beginning of what we call the medieval period. The collapse was not sudden, but gradual. For centuries, the Roman Empire had been struggling with internal conflicts, economic troubles, and pressure from various barbarian tribes. The empire had already been divided into western and eastern halves in 285 AD under Emperor Diocletian, while the Eastern Roman Empire, later known as the Byzantine Empire, would continue for another 1,000 years. The Western Empire crumbled under the weight of its challenges. The immediate causes of the fall were numerous. Political instability plagued the empire, as emperors were frequently overthrown or assassinated. The economy suffered from inflation, heavy taxation, and the cost of maintaining a massive military. Meanwhile, Germanic tribes pressed against the borders, not necessarily as conquerors, but often as refugees seeking safety from the advancing Huns. The Huns, led by their fearsome king Attila, had swept across Eastern Europe, displacing numerous Germanic tribes. These displaced peoples, including the Visigoths, Ostrogoths, Vandals, and others, sought new homes within Roman territories. Sometimes they came as allies, sometimes as invaders, but their presence fundamentally changed the character of the Western Empire. The migration period, what historians once called the barbarian invasions, is now more accurately termed the migration period. This era saw massive movements of peoples across Europe, reshaping the continent's ethnic and political landscape. The migrations were complex phenomena, involving entire tribes seeking new lands due to climate change, population pressure, and the domino effect of other migrations. The Visigoths established kingdoms in southern France and Spain. The Ostrogoths controlled much of Italy. The Vandals crossed through Gaul and Spain before settling in North Africa. The Lombards eventually established a kingdom in northern Italy. The Angles, Saxons, and Jutes crossed the North Sea to settle in Britain. Each of these peoples brought their own customs, laws, and traditions, creating a patchwork of different cultures across former Roman territories. These migrations were not simply destructive forces. The Germanic peoples had been in contact with Roman civilization for centuries. Many had served in Roman armies, traded with Roman merchants, and adopted aspects of Roman culture. When they established their kingdoms, they often tried to maintain Roman administrative practices and legal traditions, blending them with their own customs. The Frankish kingdom emerged as particularly important. Under their king Clovis I, who ruled from 481 to 511 AD, the Franks not only conquered much of Gaul but also converted to Catholic Christianity. This conversion was politically significant because it aligned the Franks with the existing Roman population, who were largely Christian, and with the powerful Catholic Church. The rise of Christianity. Christianity's spread throughout Europe was one of the most profound changes of the early medieval period. While Christianity had been legalized in the Roman Empire in 3013 AD under Constantine the Great, it was during the medieval period that it truly became the defining force of European civilization. The conversion of the barbarian kingdoms to Christianity was a gradual process that took centuries. Some groups, like the Goths, had already been converted to Arian Christianity before their migrations. Arianism, however, was considered heretical by the Catholic Church because it denied the full divinity of Christ. The conversion of these groups to Catholic Christianity often followed political considerations. Monasticism played a crucial role in spreading Christianity and preserving classical knowledge. Monks like Saint Benedict of Nursia established rules for monastic life that emphasized prayer, work, and study. Monasteries became centers of learning where manuscripts were copied and preserved. Without the work of these monks, much of classical literature and learning would have been lost forever. The missionary activities of the Church were instrumental in converting pagan peoples. St. Patrick's mission to Ireland in the 5th century, St. Augustine's mission to England in 597 AD, and St. Boniface's work among the Germanic peoples in the 8th century exemplify the Church's evangelical efforts. These missionaries not only spread Christian beliefs, but also introduced Roman writing systems, legal concepts, and administrative practices. Christian theology provided a new framework for understanding the world. The concept of a single, all-powerful God replaced the polytheistic beliefs of the Germanic and Celtic peoples. The Christian emphasis on charity, forgiveness, and the afterlife offered hope to people living in uncertain times. The Church also provided social services, caring for the poor, sick, and orphaned. The Merovingian Dynasty. The Frankish kingdom under the Merovingian Dynasty became the most powerful Germanic kingdom in Western Europe. Named after their legendary ancestor Merovex, the Merovingians ruled from the 5th to the 8th centuries. Their most famous king, Clovis I, unified most of the Frankish tribes and converted to Catholic Christianity around 496 AD. Clovis's conversion was a turning point in European history. Unlike other Germanic rulers who had adopted Arian Christianity, Clovis embraced Catholic Christianity, the same faith as his Roman subjects. This decision gained him the support of the Catholic bishops and helped legitimize his rule over the former Roman population. Under Clovis and his successors, the Frankish kingdom expanded to include most of modern France, parts of Germany, and portions of neighboring regions. The Merovingians established their capital at Paris and created a court culture that blended Frankish and Roman traditions. However, the later Merovingian kings are often called the lazy kings or do-nothing kings because real power gradually shifted to their chief ministers, known as mayors of the palace. These mayors controlled the royal household, managed the kingdom's finances, and commanded the army. The most famous of these mayors was Charles Martel. Charles Martel and the Battle of Tours. Charles Martel, whose name means Charles the Hammer, was the mayor of the palace under the Merovingian kings. He is best remembered for his victory at the Battle of Tours in 732 AD, where he defeated an Islamic army that had crossed the Pyrenees from Spain. The Islamic conquest of Spain had been swift and decisive. In 711 AD, Muslim forces under Tariq ibn Ziyad crossed from North Africa and rapidly conquered the Visigothic kingdom. The Muslims, whom the Christians called Moors or Saracens, established the Emirate of Córdoba and began raiding into southern France. The Battle of Tours, also known as the Battle of Poitiers, was fought between Tours and Poitiers in October 732. Charles Martel's Frankish army faced a Muslim force led by Abd al-Rahman al-Ghafiqi. The battle lasted several days, but ultimately the Franks achieved victory. Abd al-Rahman was killed, and the Muslim army retreated south. This victory had enormous psychological impact throughout Christian Europe. It demonstrated that the seemingly unstoppable Muslim expansion could be halted. Charles Martel was hailed as the savior of Christianity and the defender of Europe. The battle also established the Frankish kingdom as the preeminent Christian power in Western Europe. Charles Martel's victory was significant, not just militarily, but also politically. It consolidated his power and paved the way for his son Pepin the Short to eventually overthrow the Merovingian dynasty and establish the Carolingian dynasty. The Battle of Tours thus represents a crucial moment in the formation of medieval Europe. The Carolingian Revolution. Pepin the Short, Charles Martel's son, took the momentous step of deposing the last Merovingian king, Childeric III, in 751 AD. This action required careful political maneuvering because it meant overthrowing a dynasty that had ruled for centuries and whose legitimacy was deeply rooted in Frankish tradition. Pepin sought the approval of Pope Zachary for his actions. The Pope declared that it was better for the one who had the power to be called king rather than the one who remained powerless. This papal approval was crucial because it provided religious legitimacy for the change of dynasty. In return for papal support, Pepin promised to defend the Papal States against the Lombards, who threatened Rome. This alliance between the Frankish kingdom and the papacy would prove to be one of the most important political relationships in medieval Europe. Pepin was crowned king by Saint Boniface, the great English missionary to the Germans. This coronation was significant because it established the precedent of religious approval for royal authority. The ceremony emphasized that kings ruled by divine grace and had religious responsibilities as well as secular ones. The Carolingian Dynasty, named after Pepin's father Charles Martel, Carolus in Latin, would rule the Frankish kingdom for over 2 centuries. Under the Carolingians, the Frankish kingdom would reach its greatest extent and become the dominant power in Western Europe. Charlemagne's early reign. Pep, in the short, died in 7068 AD, dividing his kingdom between his 2 sons, Charles and Carloman. This division initially created tensions between the brothers, but Carloman's death in 7071 allowed Charles to reunite the kingdom under his sole rule. Charles, who would later be known as Charlemagne or Charles the Great, inherited a kingdom that was already the most powerful in Western Europe. However, he would expand it far beyond anything his predecessors had achieved. His reign lasted from 7068 to 814 AD and marked the height of early medieval European civilization. From the beginning of his reign, Charlemagne showed himself to be an energetic and ambitious ruler. He continued his father's policy of supporting the papacy while expanding Frankish power through almost constant warfare. His military campaigns would eventually create an empire that stretched from the Atlantic Ocean to the Danube River. Charlemagne's first major military endeavor was the continuation of his father's wars against the Lombards in Italy. The Lombards had continued to threaten papal territories despite previous Frankish interventions. In 773, Charlemagne led a massive expedition across the Alps, defeated the Lombard king Desiderius, and incorporated the Lombard kingdom into his domains. This conquest made Charlemagne the most powerful ruler in Western Europe and the protector of the Pope. It also brought him into contact with the sophisticated culture of northern Italy, which would influence his later cultural policies. The Saxon Wars. Charlemagne's longest and most difficult military campaigns were against the Saxons, a Germanic people who occupied much of modern northern Germany. The Saxon Wars lasted over 30 years and were marked by extreme brutality on both sides. The Saxons were pagans who worshipped traditional Germanic gods and had never been conquered by the Romans. They lived in tribal societies without centralized political authority, making them difficult to defeat definitively. Each victory over one Saxon group would be followed by rebellions from others. The wars began in 7072, when Charlemagne destroyed the Irminsul, a sacred pillar that was central to Saxon religious beliefs. This act of desecration sparked decades of conflict. Charlemagne would win battles and impose treaties requiring Saxon conversion to Christianity, only to face new rebellions when his armies departed. The most notorious incident occurred at Verdun in 782, where Charlemagne allegedly ordered the execution of 4,500 Saxon prisoners who had rebelled after converting to Christianity. This massacre, known as the Massacre of Verdun, demonstrates the religious dimension of these conflicts and the extreme measures Charlemagne was willing to use to enforce Christian conversion. The Saxon leader Widukind became a legendary figure, leading resistance against Frankish rule for years. His eventual surrender and baptism in 785 marked a turning point in the wars, though fighting continued for nearly 2 more decades. The conquest of the Saxons was finally completed in 804, making Charlemagne the ruler of the largest empire in Western Europe since the fall of Rome. The Saxons were forcibly converted to Christianity, and their lands were incorporated into the Frankish administrative system. Early medieval society and economy. Life in early medieval Europe was predominantly rural and agricultural. The vast majority of the population lived in small villages and worked the land. The collapse of Roman trade networks and the political fragmentation of Europe had led to a largely self-sufficient economy based on local production and consumption. The basic unit of agricultural production was the villa or estate, which included the lord's residence, fields worked by peasants, and various workshops and storage facilities. Most peasants lived in simple wooden houses with thatched roofs. They grew cereals like wheat, barley, and oats, and raised livestock including cattle, pigs, and chickens. Technology during this period was relatively simple but effective. The heavy plow, which had been developed during the later Roman period, became more widespread. This plow was better suited to the heavy soils of northern Europe than the lighter Mediterranean plow. The three-field system of crop rotation also became more common, allowing for better soil management and increased productivity. Trade, while reduced from Roman levels, never entirely disappeared. Local markets continued to function, and long-distance trade, though limited, connected Europe with the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic world. Merchants traded in luxury goods like spices, silk, and precious metals, as well as more mundane items like salt and iron tools. The social structure of early medieval Europe was hierarchical but flexible. At the top were the kings and their noble followers, who controlled land and military power. Below them were free farmers, craftsmen, and merchants. At the bottom were slaves, though slavery was gradually giving way to serfdom, a system where peasants were bound to the land but had some legal rights. Women's roles varied depending on their social class. Noble women could inherit property and sometimes wielded considerable political influence. Peasant women worked alongside men in the fields and managed household economies. The Christian Church provided some opportunities for women through monastic life, where abbesses could wield significant authority. The Celtic Periphery. While continental Europe was dominated by Germanic kingdoms, the Celtic Periphery, Ireland, Wales, Scotland, and Brittany, maintained distinct cultures that blended Celtic traditions with Christianity. These regions would play important roles in preserving and transmitting classical learning during the early medieval period. Ireland had never been conquered by the Romans and had developed a unique form of Christianity. Irish monasticism was particularly vigorous, producing scholars and missionaries who would influence European Christianity for centuries. Irish monks like St. Columba and St. Columbanus established monasteries throughout Europe and helped convert pagan peoples to Christianity. The Irish also developed a distinctive artistic style that combined Celtic decorative motifs with Christian symbolism. The Book of Kells, an illuminated manuscript of the Gospels created around 800 AD, exemplifies this artistic tradition with its intricate interlaced patterns and vivid colors. Wales retained its Celtic culture and language while gradually adopting Christianity. Welsh kingdoms like Gwynedd and Powys maintained their independence from Anglo-Saxon England for centuries. Welsh literature, including the earliest Arthurian legends, preserved Celtic storytelling traditions that would later influence European literature. Scotland was divided between Celtic Scots and Picts in the north and Anglo-Saxon influence in the south. The monastery of Iona, founded by St. Columba in 56-3, became a major center of Celtic Christianity and learning. From Iona, monks carried Christianity to Northumbria and other parts of Anglo-Saxon England. Charlemagne's coronation. On Christmas Day in the year 800 AD, one of the most significant events in medieval European history took place in St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. Pope Leo III crowned Charlemagne as Emperor of the Romans, reviving the Western Roman Empire after more than 3 centuries. The coronation was the culmination of Charlemagne's relationship with the papacy. In 799, Pope Leo III had been attacked by Roman nobles and fled to Charlemagne for protection. Charlemagne traveled to Rome, restored the Pope to his position, and received the imperial crown in return. According to Einhard, Charlemagne's biographer, the king was surprised by the coronation and claimed he would not have entered the church if he had known the Pope's intentions. This account is probably diplomatic fiction designed to avoid offending the Byzantine Empire, which still claimed to be the legitimate Roman Empire. The coronation established several important precedents. It demonstrated that the Pope had the authority to crown emperors, giving the Church a role in legitimizing secular authority. It also created the concept of the Holy Roman Empire, which would dominate Central European politics for over 1,000 years. The title of emperor gave Charlemagne theoretical authority over all of Western Christendom. In practical terms, it recognized what was already true, that Charlemagne ruled the largest and most powerful state in Western Europe since the fall of Rome. The Carolingian Renaissance. Under Charlemagne and his successors, Europe experienced a cultural revival known as the Carolingian Renaissance. This intellectual movement sought to preserve classical learning, improve education, and standardize Christian practices throughout the empire. Charlemagne himself was barely literate, but he recognized the importance of education and learning. He gathered scholars from across Europe to his court at Aachen. The most famous of these was Alcuin of York, an English monk who became Charlemagne's chief educational advisor. Alcuin established a palace school that became a model for educational institutions throughout the empire. The curriculum included the 7 liberal arts: grammar, rhetoric, logic, arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music. Students studied classical authors like Virgil and Cicero alongside Christian texts. The Carolingians also promoted the copying and preservation of manuscripts. Monasteries throughout the empire became centers of manuscript production. Monks developed a new, clearer script called Carolingian minuscule, which became the basis for modern lowercase letters. This educational revival was not merely academic. Charlemagne issued capitularies requiring all monasteries and cathedral schools to maintain schools. He wanted to create a literate clergy capable of properly performing religious services and administering the empire's affairs. The Carolingian Renaissance also saw innovations in architecture and art. The palace chapel at Aachen, modeled on Byzantine buildings, demonstrated the empire's wealth and ambition. Illuminated manuscripts from this period show sophisticated artistic techniques and beautiful decorative elements. Administration of the Carolingian Empire. Governing such a vast empire required sophisticated administrative systems. Charlemagne adapted Frankish traditions to create new institutions for ruling his diverse territories. The empire was divided into counties, each governed by a count appointed by the emperor. Counts were responsible for maintaining order, collecting taxes, and raising troops when needed. They held court sessions to resolve legal disputes and implemented imperial laws known as capitularies. To prevent counts from becoming too independent, Charlemagne created the institution of missi dominici, or royal messengers. These were trusted officials who traveled throughout the empire, inspecting local administration and reporting back to the emperor. They ensured that imperial commands were being followed and that local officials were not abusing their authority. The Carolingian legal system blended different traditions. Frankish law applied to Franks, Roman law to former Roman subjects, and local customs were often preserved for other groups. This legal pluralism reflected the empire's diverse population, but also created complications. Military service remained the foundation of the Carolingian system. All free men were required to serve in the army when called upon. Wealthier individuals were expected to provide themselves with horses and armor, while poorer men served as foot soldiers. This system provided the empire with large armies but placed significant burdens on the population. The economy of the Carolingian Empire was primarily agricultural, but trade began to revive during this period. Charlemagne standardized weights, measures, and currency to facilitate commerce. Silver became the standard medium of exchange, with the silver denarius serving as the basic coin. Charlemagne's later campaigns. After his coronation, Charlemagne continued his military campaigns to secure and expand his empire. His armies fought on multiple fronts against various enemies who threatened Christian Europe. In Spain, Charlemagne established the Spanish March, a buffer zone south of the Pyrenees, to protect against Islamic attacks. The most famous episode of these campaigns was the Battle of Roncesvalles Pass in 1778, where the Frankish rearguard was ambushed by Basque warriors. This battle inspired the later epic poem, The Song of Roland. Against the Avars in the east, Charlemagne conducted a series of successful campaigns that destroyed their power and brought enormous wealth to the Frankish treasury. The Avars had been a nomadic people who controlled much of the Danube Valley and regularly raided Byzantine and Frankish territories. The conquest of the Avar Ring, their fortified capital, in 796 yielded so much gold and silver that it significantly boosted the Frankish economy. This wealth helped fund Charlemagne's building projects and military campaigns for years to come. In Italy, Charlemagne consolidated Frankish control and defended papal territories against various threats. He also intervened in Byzantine affairs, though his attempts to arrange a marriage alliance with the Byzantine Empire ultimately failed. Daily life in the Carolingian Empire. Life for most people in Charlemagne's empire remained centered on agriculture and local communities. The majority of the population lived in small villages and worked as farmers, though there were significant regional variations in living conditions and social organization. The typical peasant family lived in a simple wooden house with a thatched roof. These homes usually consisted of a single room where the family cooked, ate, and slept. Animals were often kept in the same building during winter months for warmth and protection. Agricultural techniques remained relatively primitive, but some improvements occurred during this period. The heavy plow became more common, allowing farmers to work the heavy clay soils of northern Europe more effectively. The three-field system of crop rotation also spread, improving soil fertility and increasing yields. Diet for ordinary people was simple and monotonous. Bread made from various grains formed the foundation of most meals. Vegetables like cabbage, onions, and legumes provided additional nutrition. Meat was rare for most people, though dairy products were more common where cattle were raised. The nobility lived very differently. Their large estates provided them with varied diets, including meat, fish, and imported luxury goods. Noble households were centers of political and social activity, where warriors gathered to feast and plan military campaigns. Women's roles varied by social class. Noble women could inherit property and sometimes wielded considerable political influence. They managed large household economies and played important roles in diplomacy through marriage alliances. Peasant women worked in the fields alongside men and were responsible for managing household production, including food preparation, textile production, and childcare. The division of the empire. Charlemagne died in 814 AD and was succeeded by his only surviving son, Louis the Pious. Louis faced the enormous challenge of maintaining unity in such a vast and diverse empire. His reign was marked by internal conflicts that ultimately led to the empire's division. Louis attempted to plan for succession by dividing the empire among his three sons, while maintaining overall unity under the eldest. However, this plan was complicated by his remarriage and the birth of another son, Charles the Bald. The resulting succession disputes led to civil wars that weakened the empire. The most serious conflict occurred when Louis's sons rebelled against him in 830 and again in 8. After Louis the Pious died in 840, his surviving sons fought for control of the empire. The conflict was resolved by the Treaty of Verdun in 843, which divided the empire into three kingdoms: the West Frankish Kingdom, roughly modern France, the East Frankish Kingdom, roughly modern Germany, and the Middle Kingdom, stretching from the North Sea to Italy. This division marked the beginning of the end of Carolingian unity. The three kingdoms developed separately and would eventually become the foundations of modern France, Germany, and Italy. The Viking Age begins. As the Carolingian Empire weakened, new threats emerged from the north. The Vikings, seafaring peoples from Scandinavia, began raiding European coasts and rivers in the late 8th century. The first recorded Viking raid occurred at Lindisfarne, a monastery off the coast of northern England, in 7093 AD. This attack shocked the Christian world because monasteries had been considered safe from warfare. The Vikings showed no respect for Christian sanctity and targeted monasteries for their wealth. Viking raids initially focused on monasteries and coastal settlements, but they gradually became more ambitious. Viking fleets sailed up major rivers like the Seine, Loire, and Rhine, attacking cities far inland. Paris was besieged multiple times, and many other important centers suffered Viking attacks. The Vikings were skilled seafarers whose longships could navigate both open seas and shallow rivers. These ships were fast, maneuverable, and could be easily beached, allowing Vikings to strike quickly and retreat before defenders could respond effectively. Initially, most Viking expeditions were hit-and-run raids aimed at capturing slaves and portable wealth. However, by the mid-9th century, some Viking groups began establishing permanent settlements. The Great Heathen Army invaded England in 865 and conquered large portions of the country. The decline of Carolingian power. The later Carolingian rulers proved unable to deal effectively with the Viking threat or maintain central authority. The empire's defensive systems were designed for fighting conventional armies, not fast-moving raiders who could strike anywhere along the extensive coastline and river systems. Local nobles increasingly took responsibility for defending their own territories. They built fortifications, raised their own armies, and made independent decisions about how to deal with Viking attacks. This localization of defense further weakened central authority. The Carolingians also faced challenges from other directions. Muslim raiders from Spain attacked southern France. Magyar horsemen from the east raided deep into German territories. The empire seemed under attack from all sides, while the central government grew weaker. Political fragmentation accelerated as the empire was further subdivided among multiple heirs. By 8087, the last Carolingian emperor, Charles the Fat, was deposed, and the empire effectively ceased to exist as a unified entity. The emergence of new powers. As Carolingian authority collapsed, new political entities emerged to fill the power vacuum. In the West Frankish kingdom, the Capetian dynasty would eventually establish the Kingdom of France. In the East Frankish kingdom, the Ottonian dynasty would create the Holy Roman Empire. Local strongmen, often called castellans, built castles and established control over surrounding territories. These castle-based lordships became the foundation of the feudal system that would dominate medieval Europe for centuries. The church also adapted to changing circumstances. Monasteries fortified themselves against Viking attacks. Some monks became warriors to defend their communities. The ideal of the peaceful monk gave way to more militaristic forms of Christianity. Despite the political chaos, economic and technological development continued. New agricultural techniques increased food production. Population began to grow after centuries of stagnation. Towns started to revive as trade networks slowly recovered. Cultural and intellectual developments. The Carolingian Renaissance had lasting effects on European culture and education. The preservation and copying of classical texts during this period saved many works that might otherwise have been lost. The educational institutions established by Charlemagne continued to function even as political authority fragmented. The development of Carolingian minuscule script was particularly important. This clear, readable script became the standard for manuscript production throughout Western Europe. It facilitated the spread of literacy and learning by making texts easier to read and copy. Theological and philosophical works from this period influenced European thought for centuries. Scholars like John Scotus Eriugena and Rabanus Maurus wrote commentaries on classical and Christian texts that shaped medieval intellectual traditions. The period also saw important developments in art and architecture. The Carolingian architectural style influenced later Romanesque development. Illuminated manuscripts from this period demonstrate sophisticated artistic techniques and aesthetic sensibilities. The rise of feudalism. As central authority collapsed throughout Europe in the 9th and 10th centuries, a new social and political system emerged to fill the void. This system, later called feudalism, was based on personal relationships, land tenure, and military service. Feudalism developed gradually from earlier practices. The Roman system of patronage, Germanic warrior bands, and Carolingian administrative practices all contributed to its formation. However, the immediate catalyst was the need for defense against Viking, Magyar, and Muslim raids when central governments proved unable to provide protection. The feudal system was based on the exchange of land for military service. A lord would grant a piece of land, called a fief, to a vassal in exchange for military service and loyalty. This relationship was formalized through a ceremony of homage, where the vassal would kneel before his lord, place his hands between the lord's hands, and swear an oath of fealty. The feudal hierarchy theoretically extended from the king at the top, down to the lowest knight. In practice, however, the system was much more complex. A single person could be a lord to some people and a vassal to others. Land tenure was often disputed, and loyalties could be divided when vassals held fiefs from multiple lords. At the bottom of the feudal hierarchy were the peasants, who worked the land but were not part of the feudal contract system. Most peasants were serfs, bound to the land and unable to leave without their lord's permission. They owed various obligations to their lords, including labor service, rent payments, and fees for using mills and other facilities. The manor became the basic economic unit of feudal society. A typical manor included the lord's residence, peasant villages, fields, forests, and pastures. The manor was largely self-sufficient, producing most of what its inhabitants needed to survive. The Holy Roman Empire. In the East Frankish Kingdom, a new dynasty emerged to restore imperial authority, the Saxon or Ottonian dynasty, beginning with Henry I, the Fowler in 919, would create what became known as the Holy Roman Empire. Otto I, who ruled from 936 to 973, was the most successful of the early Ottonian rulers. He defeated the Magyars at the Battle of Lechfeld in 955, ending their raids into Western Europe. This victory established Otto as the defender of Christendom and enhanced his prestige throughout Europe. In 962, Otto I traveled to Rome and was crowned emperor by Pope John XII. This coronation revived the imperial title in the West and established the Holy Roman Empire, which would last until 8. Unlike Charlemagne's empire, however, the Holy Roman Empire was primarily centered in Germany and Italy. The relationship between emperor and pope was complex and often conflicted. While the pope crowned the emperor, giving the church a role in legitimizing secular authority, the emperor also claimed authority over the church within his territories. This tension would lead to major conflicts in later centuries. Otto I and his successors also established the policy of appointing bishops and abbots to important positions in imperial administration. These ecclesiastical princes received secular authority along with their religious responsibilities, making them key supporters of imperial power. The Ottonian Renaissance, similar to the earlier Carolingian Renaissance, saw renewed interest in classical learning and artistic achievement. The Ottonian court became a center of scholarship, art, and literature. Manuscripts produced during this period show sophisticated artistic techniques and creative innovations. The Cluniac reform movement. The 10th and 11th centuries saw a major reform movement within the Catholic Church, centered on the monastery of Cluny in Burgundy. Founded in 910 by Duke William of Aquitaine, Cluny was granted unprecedented independence from secular and local ecclesiastical control. The Cluniac reform movement sought to address corruption and worldliness within the church. Many monasteries had fallen under the control of local nobles who appointed abbots for political rather than religious reasons. Clerical marriage and simony, the buying and selling of church offices, were common problems. Clunia established a network of reformed monasteries throughout Europe. Unlike traditional monasteries which were independent institutions, Cluniac houses remained under the authority of the abbot of Cluny. This centralized system ensured that reforms were maintained over time. The Cluniac reformers emphasized strict observance of the rule of Saint Benedict, elaborate liturgical celebrations, and independence from secular control. They also promoted the Peace of God movement, which sought to limit warfare and protect non-combatants from violence. The influence of Cluny extended far beyond monasticism. Cluniac monks became bishops and popes, spreading reform ideals throughout the church hierarchy. The movement prepared the way for later papal reform efforts that would transform medieval Christianity. The Peace and Truce of God movements. As feudal warfare became endemic throughout Europe, the Church attempted to limit violence through the Peace of God and Truce of God movements. These movements sought to protect certain groups of people and establish periods when fighting was forbidden. The Peace of God movement, beginning in the late 10th century, declared that certain people should never be targets of violence. This protection extended to clergy, pilgrims, merchants, women, children, and peasants working in the fields. Violations of the peace of God were punishable by excommunication. The Truce of God, developing in the 11th century, established times when all fighting should cease. Initially, this applied to weekends, from Saturday evening to Monday morning, but it gradually expanded to include Advent, Lent, and major feast days. Eventually, warfare was theoretically forbidden for nearly half the year. These movements had mixed success. While they did not end feudal warfare, they did establish important principles about the conduct of war and the protection of non-combatants. They also demonstrated the Church's growing influence in secular affairs and its role as a moral authority in medieval society. The Peace and Truce of God movements also contributed to the development of chivalry. The code of conduct for knights. Chivalric ideals emphasized protection of the weak, respect for the Church, and honorable behavior in warfare. Though these ideals were often honored in the breach, they did influence noble behavior and culture. The Norman conquest of England. One of the most significant events of the 11th century was the Norman conquest of England in 1066. This conquest brought England firmly into the mainstream of European feudal civilization and had profound effects on English culture, language, and institutions. The conquest originated from a disputed succession to the English throne. When Edward the Confessor died childless in 1066, several claimants emerged. Harold Godwinson was elected by the English nobles, but William, Duke of Normandy, claimed that Edward had promised him the throne and that Harold had sworn to support his claim. William assembled a large invasion force and crossed the English Channel in September 10. Meanwhile, Harold faced another invasion from Harald Hardrada of Norway in the north. Harold defeated the Norwegian invasion at Stamford Bridge, but then had to march rapidly south to face William's army. The Battle of Hastings, fought on October 14, 1066, was one of the most decisive battles in English history. Harold's army, tired from their rapid march and recent battle, faced William's fresh forces. The battle lasted all day, but eventually Harold was killed and his army routed. William's victory was complete, but it took several years to fully conquer England. He systematically replaced the Anglo-Saxon nobility with Norman followers, redistributed land according to feudal principles, and introduced Norman administrative practices. The Norman conquest had lasting effects on English culture and language. Norman French became the language of the court and nobility, while Anglo-Saxon remained the language of the common people. Over time, these languages merged to create Middle English. Norman architectural styles also transformed English building, introducing the Romanesque style to England. The Investiture Controversy. The growing power of the Reformed papacy led to a major conflict with secular rulers over the appointment of bishops and abbots. This conflict, known as the Investiture Controversy, lasted from 1075 to 1122 and fundamentally changed the relationship between church and state. The controversy began when Pope Gregory VII prohibited lay investiture, the practice of secular rulers appointing bishops and investing them with the symbols of their spiritual authority. Gregory argued that only the church could appoint its own officials and that secular rulers had no authority over spiritual matters. Emperor Henry IV refused to accept this prohibition, arguing that bishops and abbots in his territories were also secular officials with important administrative responsibilities. The conflict escalated when Gregory excommunicated Henry and declared his subjects released from their oaths of loyalty. Henry's famous journey to Canossa in 1077 to seek papal forgiveness demonstrated the power of the Reformed papacy. Standing barefoot in the snow for 3 days, Henry performed public penance before Gregory lifted his excommunication. However, this humiliation only temporarily resolved the conflict. Fighting continued for decades between papal and imperial supporters throughout Italy and Germany. The controversy was finally resolved by the Concordat of Worms in 1122, which established a compromise. The Church gained the right to elect bishops and invest them with spiritual authority, while secular rulers retained the right to invest them with temporal authority and influence the selection process. The Investiture Controversy established important principles about the relationship between spiritual and temporal authority. It demonstrated the Church's independence from secular control and its role as a moral authority that could challenge secular rulers. However, it also showed the limitations of papal power and the need for compromise with secular authorities. The First Crusade. In 1095, Pope Urban II launched one of the most momentous movements in medieval history by calling for a crusade to liberate the Holy Land from Muslim control. This call would lead to 2 centuries of religious warfare that profoundly affected both Christian and Islamic civilizations. The immediate cause of the First Crusade was a request for help from Byzantine Emperor Alexius I, who was facing pressure from Seljuk Turks in Anatolia. However, Urban's vision was much grander, a holy war to recapture Jerusalem and the other holy sites of Christianity. Urban preached the crusade at the Council of Clermont in France in November 1095. He promised participants remission of sins, protection of their property while absent, and the opportunity to win glory in service to God. The response was overwhelming, far exceeding anything Urban had anticipated. The First Crusade attracted people from all social levels. Nobles saw opportunities for land and glory. Peasants were motivated by religious fervor and hopes for a better life. The movement also attracted less savory elements, including criminals seeking to escape punishment and adventurers looking for profit. Peter the Hermit led a popular crusade that set off before the official military expedition. This people's crusade was poorly organized and equipped. Most participants were killed by Turks in Anatolia, demonstrating the difficulty of the enterprise. The official First Crusade, led by nobles like Godfrey of Bouillon, Bohemond of Taranto, and Raymond of Toulouse, was better organized and equipped. After 3 years of difficult campaigning, the Crusaders captured Jerusalem in July 1099. The conquest was marked by a massacre of the city's Muslim and Jewish inhabitants. The success of the First Crusade led to the establishment of 4 Crusader states: the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the Principality of Antioch, the County of Edessa, and the County of Tripoli. These states were organized according to Western feudal principles, but had to adapt to local conditions and the constant threat of Muslim reconquest. The growth of towns and trade. The 11th and 12th centuries saw a remarkable revival of urban life and long-distance trade throughout Europe. This commercial revolution transformed medieval society and laid the foundations for future economic development. Several factors contributed to this urban revival. Population growth created demand for goods and services that rural areas could not provide. Technological improvements in agriculture freed some workers from food production. Political stability in some regions made trade safer and more profitable. The growth of towns created new social groups that did not fit easily into the traditional feudal hierarchy. Merchants, craftsmen, and other urban dwellers owed their living to commerce rather than agriculture. They demanded rights and privileges that recognized their different way of life. Many towns obtained charters from their lords that granted them self-government, the right to hold markets, and freedom from certain feudal obligations. These charters created legal frameworks that protected commercial activity and encouraged economic growth. The development of guilds was another important aspect of urban growth. These associations of craftsmen or merchants regulated their respective trades, maintained quality standards, and provided mutual support for members. Guilds also played important political roles in town government. Long-distance trade connected Europe with the broader world economy. Italian merchants established trading networks that reached Byzantium, the Islamic world, and eventually Asia. Northern European merchants developed trade routes through the Baltic and North Seas. These commercial networks brought new goods, ideas, and technologies to Europe. Romanesque art and architectures. The economic and population growth of the High Middle Ages made possible a remarkable flowering of artistic and architectural achievement. The Romanesque style, which dominated European art from roughly 1000 to 1150, reflected the renewed confidence and prosperity of the age. Romanesque architecture was characterized by massive stone construction, thick walls, small windows, and rounded arches. These buildings conveyed strength and permanence, symbolizing the stability that medieval society was beginning to achieve after centuries of upheaval. The most impressive Romanesque buildings were churches and monasteries. The Church of Cluny III, begun in 1088, was the largest building in Europe when it was completed. Its massive scale demonstrated both the wealth of the Cluniac movement and the importance of monasticism in medieval society. Romanesque sculpture adorned church portals, capitals, and other architectural elements. These sculptures served both decorative and didactic purposes, teaching biblical stories and moral lessons to a largely illiterate population. The tympanum over the main door of a church often depicted the Last Judgment, reminding viewers of their ultimate fate. The development of the pilgrimage routes also contributed to architectural innovation. Churches along major pilgrimage routes, especially the route to Santiago de Compostela in Spain, were enlarged and modified to accommodate large numbers of pilgrims. These churches pioneered new structural techniques and architectural forms. Manuscript illumination also reached new heights. During the Romanesque period, monastic scriptoriums produced lavishly decorated books that combined text with elaborate imagery. These manuscripts preserved classical and Christian learning while showcasing the artistic achievements of their creators. The rise of Scholasticism. The 11th and 12th centuries saw the emergence of Scholasticism, a new approach to learning that sought to reconcile Christian faith with classical philosophy, particularly the works of Aristotle. This intellectual movement would dominate medieval education and thought for centuries. The rediscovery of Aristotle's works, largely through Arabic translations and commentaries, presented medieval thinkers with a systematic philosophical approach to understanding the natural world. However, some Aristotelian ideas seemed to conflict with Christian doctrine, creating intellectual challenges that scholastic thinkers sought to resolve. Early scholastic thinkers like Anselm of Canterbury and Peter Abelard developed new methods of intellectual inquiry. They emphasized the use of reason in understanding religious truth, while maintaining that faith was ultimately superior to reason. Their debates about the relationship between faith and reason shaped medieval intellectual culture. The development of cathedral schools and early universities provided institutional frameworks for scholastic education. The University of Bologna, established in the late 11th century, specialized in law. The University of Paris, emerging in the early 12th century, became the leading center for theology and philosophy. These institutions attracted students from throughout Europe, creating an international community of scholars. The use of Latin as the universal language of learning facilitated this intellectual exchange and helped spread new ideas across political and cultural boundaries. The Second and Third Crusade. The success of the First Crusade proved temporary. Muslim forces under capable leaders began to reconquer the Crusader states, leading to calls for new crusades to defend Christian holdings in the Holy Land. The Second Crusade was launched in 1147, after the fall of Edessa, to the Muslim leader Zengi. This crusade was preached by the influential Cistercian monk Bernard of Clairvaux and attracted two major monarchs, Louis VII of France and Conrad III of Germany. Despite this royal participation, the Second Crusade was a complete failure. The armies of Louis and Conrad were defeated separately in Anatolia by the Seljuk Turks. Those who survived reached the Holy Land, but failed to achieve any significant conquests. The crusade ended in 1149 with nothing to show for the enormous effort and expense. The Third Crusade, launched in 1189, was prompted by Saladin's reconquest of Jerusalem in 1187. Saladin was a Kurdish leader who had united Egypt and Syria under his rule and proved to be one of the most formidable opponents the Crusaders ever faced. The Third Crusade attracted three of Europe's most powerful rulers: Frederick Barbarossa of the Holy Roman Empire, Philip Augustus of France, and Richard I of England, known as the Lionheart. This impressive array of leadership raised hopes for success. However, the crusade was plagued by problems from the start. Frederick Barbarossa drowned while crossing a river in Anatolia, and most of his army returned home. Philip Augustus and Richard I quarreled constantly, and Philip returned to France after the capture of Acre in 11. Richard continued the campaign alone and proved to be a capable military commander. He defeated Saladin at the Battle of Arsuf in 1191 and came close to recapturing Jerusalem. However, he ultimately decided that holding Jerusalem would be impossible without controlling the surrounding territory. The crusade ended in 1192 with the Treaty of Jaffa, which gave Christians access to Jerusalem as pilgrims while leaving the city under Muslim control. Richard's failure to recapture Jerusalem was seen as a major disappointment, though the treaty did secure Christian control of a narrow coastal strip. The Gothic Revolution in architecture. Around 1140, a revolutionary new architectural style emerged in France that would transform European building for the next several centuries. Gothic architecture, which began at the Abbey Church of Saint Denis near Paris, represented a dramatic departure from the massive fortress-like qualities of Romanesque buildings. The Gothic style was characterized by pointed arches, ribbed vaults, and flying buttresses. These innovations allowed builders to create much taller structures with thinner walls and larger windows. The result was buildings that seemed to soar upward toward heaven, filled with light that was seen as a symbol of divine presence. The first fully Gothic building was the Choir of Saint Denis, rebuilt by Abbot Suger between 1140 and 1144. Suger believed that beautiful objects and spaces could help worshippers connect with the divine. His church was designed to create an atmosphere of transcendence through architecture and light. The Gothic style spread rapidly throughout France and then to the rest of Europe. Each region developed its own variations, but the basic principles remained consistent. In England, Gothic architecture evolved into distinctive styles like Early English and Decorated. In Germany, Gothic churches reached extraordinary heights, with some spires extending over 500 feet into the air. Cathedral building became a communal enterprise that could take centuries to complete. Entire cities would mobilize resources for these projects, with wealthy citizens donating money and ordinary people contributing labor. The construction process required skilled craftsmen, including stonemasons, carpenters, glaziers, and sculptors who developed increasingly sophisticated techniques. Gothic cathedrals were not just places of worship, but also centers of community life. They hosted markets, served as meeting places, and provided sanctuary for those seeking protection. The elaborate sculptural programs that adorned Gothic facades told biblical stories and moral lessons to a largely illiterate population. The rise of university. The 12th and 13th centuries witnessed the establishment of universities throughout Europe. These institutions revolutionized higher education and became centers of intellectual activity that would shape European thought for centuries. The University of Bologna, established in the late 11th century, was the first true university in Europe. It specialized in legal studies and attracted students from throughout the continent who came to study Roman and canon law. Bologna's success inspired the creation of similar institutions elsewhere. The University of Paris emerged in the early 12th century from the cathedral schools of Notre Dame. It became the premier center for theological and philosophical studies in Europe. The university attracted famous teachers like Peter Abelard and later Thomas Aquinas, who drew students from across Christendom. Other universities followed quickly. Oxford was established by 1167, when English students were expelled from Paris during a diplomatic dispute. Cambridge was founded in 1209 by scholars leaving Oxford. By 1300, there were approximately 20 universities in Europe, with more being established regularly. Universities developed standardized curricula and degree systems. Students began with the trivium, grammar, rhetoric, and logic, and quadrivium, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy, before pursuing advanced studies in law, medicine, or theology. The bachelor's and master's degrees originated during this period. The university community was international and mobile. Students and teachers traveled freely between institutions, creating a shared intellectual culture throughout Europe. Latin served as the universal language of scholarship, enabling this academic mobility. Universities also developed their own legal privileges and autonomy. They obtained rights of self-governance from secular and ecclesiastical authorities, establishing precedents for academic freedom that would influence educational institutions for centuries. The 12th century Renaissance. The 12th century witnessed an intellectual revival so significant that historians call it the 12th century Renaissance. This movement involved the recovery of classical learning, the development of new philosophical methods, and significant advances in science and technology. A crucial factor in this Renaissance was the translation movement that brought Greek and Arabic texts into Latin. Cities like Toledo in Spain, where Christian, Muslim, and Jewish scholars worked together, became centers of translation activity. Works by Aristotle, Ptolemy, and other classical authors became available to Western scholars for the first time in centuries. Arabic works were equally important. Muslim scholars like Ibn Sina, Avicenna, and Ibn Rushd, Averroes, had preserved and expanded upon classical learning. Their commentaries on Aristotle and their original contributions to philosophy, medicine, and science were eagerly studied by European scholars. This new learning created intellectual ferment throughout Europe. Scholars like Peter Abelard pioneered new methods of dialectical reasoning that would become central to scholastic philosophy. His work Sic et Non demonstrated how apparently contradictory authorities could be reconciled through careful analysis. The rediscovery of Aristotle posed particular challenges for Christian thinkers. Aristotle's works presented a comprehensive philosophical system based on reason rather than revelation. Some of his ideas seemed to contradict Christian doctrine, leading to heated debates about the relationship between philosophy and theology. Technical knowledge also advanced significantly during this period. New agricultural techniques, including improved plows and the three-field system, increased food production. Innovations in metallurgy, construction, and manufacturing improved the quality of life for many people. The growth of trade and urban life created demand for practical knowledge in areas like mathematics, navigation, and accounting. Italian merchants developed new mathematical techniques and accounting methods that facilitated commercial expansion. The Mendicant Orders. The early 13th century saw the emergence of new religious orders that would profoundly influence medieval spirituality and intellectual life. These mendicant begging orders rejected the traditional monastic model of withdrawal from the world in favor of active engagement with urban society. The Franciscan order was founded by Francis of Assisi around 1210. Francis was the son of a wealthy merchant who renounced his comfortable life to embrace poverty and preach to the common people. His emphasis on simplicity, poverty, and care for creation attracted many followers. The Franciscans, also known as the Friars Minor, took vows of poverty and supported themselves through begging and manual labor. They ministered to the urban poor and preached in the vernacular languages rather than Latin. Their simple, emotional style of preaching contrasted sharply with the formal theological discourse of the established clergy. The Dominican order was founded by Dominic de Guzman in 1216 with a different focus. The Dominicans, officially known as the Order of Preachers, were established primarily to combat heresy through preaching and education. They emphasized theological learning and intellectual achievement. Unlike the Franciscans, the Dominicans embraced learning from their foundation. They established schools throughout Europe and became prominent in the universities. Many of the greatest medieval theologians and philosophers, including Albert the Great and Thomas Aquinas, were Dominicans. Both orders represented new approaches to religious life that reflected the changing needs of medieval society. The growth of cities and trade had created new spiritual challenges that the traditional monasticism, designed for rural environments, could not adequately address. The success of the mendicant orders also reflected growing lay religiosity. Many people sought more personal and emotional forms of religious expression than traditional monasticism provided. The friars' emphasis on preaching and pastoral care met these spiritual needs. Thomas Aquinas and scholastic philosophy. The greatest achievement of medieval scholasticism was the philosophical and theological system developed by Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century. Aquinas successfully synthesized Aristotelian philosophy with Christian theology, creating an intellectual framework that would dominate European thought for centuries. Aquinas was born around 1225 into a noble Italian family. Despite his family's opposition, he joined the Dominican order and studied at the University of Paris under Albert the Great. Albert introduced him to the newly rediscovered works of Aristotle, which would become central to his intellectual development. Aquinas's greatest work, the Summa Theologica, was an attempt to present all Christian doctrine in a systematic, rational manner. He used Aristotelian methods of logical analysis to examine questions of theology, ethics, and philosophy. His approach demonstrated that reason and faith were compatible and mutually supporting. One of Aquinas's most important contributions was his proof for the existence of God based on Aristotelian principles. His 5 ways used rational arguments from causation, motion, and design to demonstrate that God's existence could be proven through reason alone, without relying solely on faith or revelation. Aquinas also developed sophisticated theories about natural law, just war, and political authority. His idea that human law should be based on natural law, which itself derived from eternal law, God's plan for creation, influenced legal and political thought for centuries. Initially, Aquinas' work was controversial because of its heavy reliance on Aristotle. Some church authorities feared that pagan philosophy was being given too much importance. However, his synthesis gradually gained acceptance, and by the 14th century had become the dominant theological system in the Western Church. The Fourth Crusade and the sack of Constantinople. The Fourth Crusade, launched in 1202, represented one of the most tragic episodes in medieval history. Originally intended to recapture Jerusalem, the crusade was diverted to attack Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, leading to a catastrophic split between Eastern and Western Christianity. The crusade was preached by Pope Innocent III, who hoped to reunite the Eastern and Western churches while recapturing the Holy Land. The Crusaders contracted with Venice for transportation to the east, but when they could not pay the full amount owed, they agreed to help Venice capture the Christian city of Zara. The situation became even more complex when Alexius IV, a claimant to the Byzantine throne, promised the Crusaders enormous financial rewards if they would help him gain power in Constantinople. The temptation proved irresistible, and the crusade was diverted to Byzantine territory. When Alexius IV proved unable to fulfill his promises, relations between the Crusaders and the Byzantines deteriorated rapidly. In April 1204, the Crusaders assaulted and captured Constantinople, subjecting the city to 3 days of devastating pillage. The sack of Constantinople was one of the most destructive events in medieval history. Priceless works of art were destroyed or carried off to the west. Libraries containing unique manuscripts were burned. The city's population was massacred or enslaved. The cultural treasures of 1,000 years were lost in 3 days of violence. The Crusaders established the Latin Empire of Constantinople, which lasted until 12. However, this Western conquest permanently damaged relations between Eastern and Western Christianity. The Byzantine Empire never fully recovered from the catastrophe, leaving it vulnerable to eventual Ottoman conquest. England. From Henry II to Magna Carta. England, in the 12th and early 13th centuries, experienced dramatic political developments that would influence the evolution of constitutional government throughout Europe. The reigns of Henry II and his successors saw both the expansion of royal power and the first significant limitations placed on that power. Henry II, who ruled from 1154 to 1189, created an empire that stretched from Scotland to the Pyrenees through his marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine and his own inheritances. This Angevin empire made him one of the most powerful rulers in Europe, controlling more territory in France than the French king himself. Henry's legal reforms had lasting importance for the development of English law. He established a system of royal courts with jurisdiction throughout England and developed common law procedures that applied to all free men. The growth of royal justice reduced the power of local lords and created more consistent legal standards. Henry's conflict with Thomas Becket, Archbishop of Canterbury, illustrated the ongoing tension between royal and ecclesiastical authority. When Becket defended clerical privileges against royal encroachment, Henry's angry words led to Becket's murder in Canterbury Cathedral in 11. The incident enhanced Becket's reputation as a martyr, while damaging Henry's standing with the church. Richard Ith, the Lionheart, spent most of his reign on crusade or fighting in France. His absence from England demonstrated how the administrative system established by Henry II could function without the king's direct involvement. However, Richard's military campaigns were expensive and required heavy taxation. John, who became king in 1199, faced enormous challenges, including the loss of most Angevin territories in France to Philip Augustus, conflicts with Pope Innocent III, and growing resistance from his barons. His financial demands and arbitrary rule created widespread opposition among the English nobility. The crisis came to a head in 1215 when the barons forced John to accept limitations on royal power in the document known as Magna Carta. This charter established the principle that even kings were subject to law and created procedures for addressing royal abuses of power. While Magna Carta initially applied only to the nobility, its principles would eventually be extended more broadly. The document established precedents for constitutional government and the rule of law that would influence political development in England and beyond. The Albigensian Crusade. Not all crusades were directed toward the Holy Land. The Albigensian Crusade, launched in 1209, was fought against the Cathar heretics in southern France. This internal crusade demonstrated the Church's determination to maintain religious unity and had profound effects on the culture and politics of medieval Europe. Catharism was a dualistic religion that taught the existence of two opposing principles: a good God who created the spiritual world and an evil God who created the material world. Cathars rejected many Catholic doctrines and practices, including the authority of the church hierarchy, the sacraments, and the veneration of saints. The movement was particularly strong in Languedoc, the culturally sophisticated region of southern France. The Cathars, known locally as Albigensians, after the city of Albi, attracted support from all levels of society, including some of the most powerful nobles in the region. Pope Innocent III initially tried to convert the Cathars through preaching missions led by Cistercian monks and later by Dominicans. However, when these peaceful efforts failed and a papal legate was murdered, Innocent declared a crusade against the heretics. The Albigensian Crusade attracted knights from throughout France who were promised the same spiritual rewards as those who fought in the Holy Land. The crusade was marked by extreme violence, including the massacre at Béziers in 1209 where thousands of inhabitants were killed. The military phase of the crusade lasted until 1229. But the final suppression of Catharism required the establishment of the medieval Inquisition. This judicial institution, staffed primarily by Dominican friars, used sophisticated legal procedures to identify and prosecute heretics. The Albigensian Crusade had lasting consequences beyond the defeat of Catharism. It brought northern French culture and political control to the south, ending the independent civilization of Languedoc. The sophisticated court culture that had produced the troubadours and courtly romance was largely destroyed. The decline of papal power. The late 13th and early 14th centuries witnessed a dramatic decline in papal authority that marked the end of the High Medieval period. The papacy, which had reached the height of its power under Innocent III, faced new challenges from increasingly powerful national monarchies. The conflict began with Pope Boniface VIII and King Philip IV of France over the taxation of clergy. In 1296, Boniface issued the bull Clericis Laicos, forbidding secular rulers from taxing church property without papal consent. Philip responded by prohibiting the export of gold and silver from France, effectively cutting off papal revenues. The dispute escalated when Boniface issued Unam Sanctum in 1302, declaring that salvation required submission to papal authority. This was the most extreme statement of papal supremacy ever made, but it came at a time when the papacy lacked the power to enforce such claims. Philip's response was swift and brutal. In 1303, his agent Guillaume de Nogaret seized Boniface at his residence in Anagni. Though the Pope was quickly freed by local supporters, he died within a month, possibly from the shock of his treatment. This incident, known as the Slap of Anagni, symbolized the collapse of medieval papal power. Philip then engineered the election of a French pope, Clement V, who moved the papal court from Rome to Avignon in 13. This began the Babylonian captivity of the papacy, a period lasting until 1377, when the papal court remained under French influence. The Avignon papacy was efficient and well administered, but it lost much of its moral authority. Many Europeans viewed the Avignon popes as French puppets rather than universal spiritual leaders. The papacy's credibility suffered further damage from its luxurious lifestyle and extensive bureaucracy. The Great Famine. Europe's population had grown dramatically during the High Middle Ages, but this growth made society vulnerable to crisis when conditions changed. The Great Famine of 1315–22 was the first major catastrophe to strike late medieval Europe. The famine began with unusually heavy rains in the spring of 1315 that continued through the summer and fall, Crops rotted in waterlogged fields throughout northern Europe. The following winter was harsh, and the pattern of cold, wet weather continued for several more years. Agricultural production collapsed across wide areas of Europe. Grain prices rose to levels 8 times higher than normal. People were forced to eat bark, roots, and anything else they could find. Contemporary chronicles describe scenes of starvation and desperation throughout the countryside. The famine was not merely a natural disaster, but also revealed the structural limitations of medieval agriculture. The population had grown to near the carrying capacity of the available agricultural land. Farming techniques were unable to support further expansion, and there were few reserves to fall back on during crisis. Urban areas suffered as much as rural regions. Cities depended on surrounding countryside for food supplies, and when these failed, urban populations faced starvation. Many cities expelled their poor and foreign residents to reduce demand for scarce resources. The demographic impact of the famine was severe. Mortality rates increased dramatically, with some regions losing 10–15% of their population. Birth rates also declined, as malnutrition affected fertility. The famine marked the end of the medieval population expansion that had characterized the High Middle Ages. Recovery was slow and incomplete. Even after harvests improved, European society remained vulnerable to further crises. The Great Famine had demonstrated the fragility of medieval civilization and prepared the way for even greater disasters to come. The Black Death. The Black Death was the most devastating pandemic in European history. This plague epidemic killed approximately 1/3 of Europe's population and fundamentally transformed medieval society. The pandemic's effects were so profound that they marked the definitive end of the High Middle Ages. The plague was caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, which was transmitted by fleas living on black rats. The disease had 3 forms: bubonic plague, which caused painful swellings called buboes; pneumonic plague, which attacked the lungs; and septicemic plague, which infected the bloodstream. All 3 forms had high mortality rates. The plague reached Europe in 1347, when Genoese ships arrived in Sicily, carrying infected rats and crew members. From there, it spread rapidly along trade routes throughout the Mediterranean and then northward through the rest of Europe. The speed of transmission was unprecedented for a pre-modern epidemic. Contemporary accounts describe scenes of horror and social breakdown. In some cities, half the population died within months. Bodies piled up in the streets because there were not enough living people to bury the dead. Normal social institutions collapsed under the strain of such massive mortality. The plague did not affect all groups equally. Urban areas generally suffered higher mortality rates than rural regions because of crowded living conditions. The poor died in greater numbers than the rich, though the disease showed no complete respect for social status. Clergy suffered particularly high losses because they continued to minister to the sick and dying. Economic effects were immediate and severe. Agricultural production declined due to labor shortages. Many villages were completely abandoned. Trade networks were disrupted as merchants died, and cities imposed quarantines. The value of land fell dramatically, while wages for surviving workers increased. Social tensions increased as people sought someone to blame for the catastrophe. Jews became frequent targets of persecution, accused of poisoning wells or causing the plague through ritual murder. Hundreds of Jewish communities were destroyed by mobs seeking scapegoats for their suffering. Religious responses varied widely. Some people became more devout, viewing the plague as divine punishment, requiring repentance. Others lost faith entirely, questioning how a just God could permit such suffering. New religious movements emerged, including groups of flagellants who publicly whipped themselves in hopes of appeasing divine wrath. The 100 Years' War. The 100 Years' War was not actually a single conflict, but a series of wars fought between England and France over more than a century. This prolonged struggle transformed both kingdoms and marked the transition from medieval to early modern warfare. The war began in 1337, when Edward III of England claimed the French throne following the death of the last direct Capetian king. Edward's claim was based on his descent through his mother from the French royal line, but the French nobility rejected this claim and chose Philip VI of the House of Valois instead. The underlying causes of the conflict were complex. Economic disputes over Flanders, where English wool was processed in French-controlled cities, created tensions between the kingdoms. English control of Gascony in southwestern France was another source of friction. The war thus combined dynastic, economic, and territorial disputes. Early English victories demonstrated the effectiveness of new military technologies and tactics. The English longbow proved devastatingly effective against French knights at battles like Crécy. These victories showed that traditional heavy cavalry could be defeated by well-disciplined infantry with superior weapons. The war's first phase ended with the Treaty of Bretigny in 1360, which gave England control of about one-third of France. However, fighting resumed in 1369 under the capable French leader, Bertrand du Guesclin, who used guerrilla tactics to gradually reclaim lost territory. A second English offensive began in 1415 under Henry V, who won a spectacular victory at Agincourt. The English success was so complete that the Treaty of Troyes in 1420 recognized Henry as heir to the French throne. However, Henry's death in 1422 and the appearance of Joan of Arc changed the war's trajectory. Joan of Arc, a peasant girl who claimed divine inspiration, convinced the French court to let her lead an army to relieve the besieged city of Orléans. Her success revived French morale and led to the coronation of Charles VII as king. Though Joan was captured and burned by the English in 1431, her impact on French national consciousness was lasting. The war's final phase saw gradual French reconquest of English territories. New military technologies, including gunpowder weapons, reduced the effectiveness of traditional fortifications. By 1453, England retained only the port city of Calais in France. The Western Schism, the return of the papacy from Avignon to Rome in 1377, did not restore papal unity. Instead, it led to an even greater crisis known as the Western Schism, when rival popes claimed authority simultaneously. This crisis lasted from 1378 to 1417 and severely damaged papal prestige. The schism began when Urban VI was elected pope in Rome in 1378. Urban proved to be harsh and unreasonable in his dealings with the cardinals, who declared his election invalid and chose Clement VII instead. Clement returned to Avignon, creating two rival papal courts. European kingdoms chose sides in this dispute, based largely on political considerations. France and its allies supported the Avignon Pope, while England and most German territories supported the Roman Pope. The division reflected the increasing importance of national politics in European affairs. The situation became even more complicated in 1409, when a church council at Pisa attempted to resolve the crisis by deposing both rival popes and electing a new one. However, neither existing pope accepted deposition, so there were now three men claiming to be pope simultaneously. The crisis was finally resolved by the Council of Constance, 1414–1418, which managed to secure the resignation or deposition of all three papal claimants and elect a new pope, Martin V, who was recognized throughout Western Europe. The Western Schism had lasting effects on church authority. The crisis demonstrated that popes were fallible and that councils of bishops could exercise authority over papal actions. This conciliar movement challenged traditional papal supremacy and would influence later reform movements. The rise of national monarchies. The late medieval period witnessed the strengthening of royal authority in several European kingdoms. Monarchs gradually centralized power, developed professional bureaucracies, and established more effective control over their territories. In France, the 100 Years' War paradoxically strengthened royal power. Despite military defeats, the need for defense against English invasion justified new taxes and military innovations. Charles VII created the first permanent royal army in Europe and established regular taxation without requiring noble consent. The French monarchy also benefited from the gradual conquest of independent duchies and counties. Burgundy, Brittany, and other great feudal principalities were incorporated into the royal domain through marriage, conquest, or inheritance. By 1500, the French king directly controlled most of modern France. England developed differently due to its island geography and parliamentary traditions. English kings retained strong authority but were more constrained by representative institutions. Parliament's control over taxation forced monarchs to negotiate with nobility and commoners for financial support. The Iberian kingdoms also centralized during this period. The marriage of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile in 1469 united most of Christian Spain under a single monarchy. Their conquest of Granada in 1492 completed the Christian reconquest of the peninsula. These emerging national monarchies represented a new form of political organization, unlike the universal authorities of emperor and pope that characterized the High Middle Ages. These kingdoms were based on territorial control, cultural unity, and increasingly sophisticated administrative systems. Medieval literature and culture. The late Middle Ages saw a remarkable flowering of vernacular literature that reflected changing social conditions and cultural values. Writers began composing works in their native languages rather than Latin, making literature accessible to broader audiences. The most famous work of this period was Dante's Divine Comedy, written in Italian around 1320. This epic poem described the poet's journey through hell, purgatory, and paradise under the guidance of the Roman poet Virgil and his beloved Beatrice. Dante's work established Italian as a literary language and influenced European literature for centuries. Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, written in Middle English during the late 14th century, provided a vivid portrait of English society. Through the stories told by pilgrims traveling to Canterbury, Chaucer depicted people from all social levels with humor, insight, and remarkable psychological depth. Christine de Pizan, writing in French during the early 15th century, was one of the first professional female writers in European history. Her works, including the Book of the City of Ladies, defended women's intellectual capabilities and moral worth against contemporary misogynistic attitudes. These vernacular works reflected changing cultural values. Medieval literature increasingly focused on individual psychology and personal experience rather than universal themes. The growth of urban culture and lay education created audiences for secular as well as religious literature. The period also saw the development of new artistic styles. The international Gothic style of the late 14th and early 15th centuries combined elements from different European traditions. Artists like the Limbourg brothers created illuminated manuscripts of unprecedented beauty and sophistication. Economic and social changes. The demographic catastrophes of the 14th century fundamentally altered European economic and social structures. The massive population decline caused by famine and plague created labor shortages that strengthened the position of surviving workers. Agricultural laborers demanded higher wages and better working conditions. In England, the Statute of Labourers, 1351, attempted to freeze wages at pre-plague levels, but market forces proved stronger than legislation. Serfdom began to decline in Western Europe as lords found it more profitable to rent land for money payments than to demand labor services. Urban craftsmen also benefited from labor shortages. Guilds became more exclusive as they tried to protect members' privileges. Working conditions and wages generally improved for skilled workers, though economic volatility made life uncertain for everyone. The landed nobility faced particular challenges during this period. Their traditional source of wealth, agricultural rents, declined due to population loss and rural abandonment. Many noble families struggled to maintain their customary lifestyle and political influence. Social tensions increased throughout Europe. The English Peasants' Revolt of 1381, the Jacquerie in France, 1358, and similar uprisings in other regions demonstrated popular frustration with existing social arrangements. Though these revolts were suppressed, they indicated the growing instability of traditional social hierarchies. The Renaissance began. As the 15th century dawned, a cultural movement that would transform European civilization was already underway in the Italian city-states. The Renaissance, meaning rebirth, represented a revival of classical learning and a new emphasis on human achievement and potential. The movement began in Florence during the late 14th century, fostered by wealthy merchant families like the Medici, who patronized artists, scholars, and writers. These patrons created an environment where creativity could flourish and new ideas could develop without the constraints of traditional medieval institutions. Humanist scholars like Petrarch and Boccaccio had already begun the recovery of classical texts in the 14th century. By 1400, this scholarly movement had expanded significantly. Scholars traveled throughout Europe searching monastery libraries for forgotten works by ancient authors. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 brought Greek scholars and manuscripts to the West, further enriching this classical revival. The Renaissance was not merely an intellectual movement, but also artistic and cultural. Artists like Masaccio pioneered new techniques of perspective and realistic representation that broke with medieval artistic traditions. Architecture returned to classical forms and proportions, rejecting the Gothic style that had dominated medieval building. This cultural transformation reflected deeper changes in European society. The growth of urban wealth, the decline of feudalism, and the rise of individual achievement all contributed to Renaissance values. People began to see themselves as capable of shaping their world through reason, art, and innovation rather than simply accepting traditional authorities. However, the Renaissance initially affected only a small elite. Most Europeans continued to live according to medieval patterns well into the 16th century. The transformation of European culture was gradual and uneven, varying significantly between regions and social classes. The Printing Revolution. One of the most revolutionary innovations of the 15th century was Johannes Gutenberg's development of movable type printing around 1450. This technological advance would transform European culture more profoundly than any single invention in medieval history. Gutenberg's printing press made books affordable and widely available for the first time. Before printing, books were hand-copied by scribes, making them extremely expensive and rare. A single book might cost as much as a house. After printing, books became relatively inexpensive and could be produced quickly in large quantities. The first major book printed with movable type was Gutenberg's Bible, completed around 1455. This masterpiece demonstrated the quality and potential of the new technology. Within decades, printing presses had been established throughout Europe, producing thousands of different titles. The printing revolution had far-reaching consequences. Literacy rates began to increase as books became more available. Ideas could spread rapidly across great distances. Scientific knowledge accumulated more efficiently, as researchers could build upon published works rather than relying on oral tradition or rare manuscripts. Printing also standardized languages and knowledge. Regional dialects began to give way to standardized national languages, as printed books established common spelling and vocabulary. Legal codes, religious texts, and scholarly works achieved consistency that had been impossible in the age of hand copying. The Church initially welcomed printing for its ability to spread religious knowledge. However, the technology also enabled the rapid spread of dissenting ideas. The Protestant Reformation of the 16th century would be greatly aided by the printing press, which allowed reformers to distribute their criticisms of church practices to wide audiences. The fall of Constantinople, the final collapse of the Byzantine Empire in 1453, marked the end of a political entity that had lasted for over 1,000 years. The fall of Constantinople to the Ottoman Turks was both a military triumph for Islam and a symbolic end to the medieval world. The Byzantine Empire had been declining for centuries, reduced to little more than the city of Constantinople and some surrounding territory. The empire faced constant pressure from the expanding Ottoman Empire, which had conquered most of the former Byzantine territories in Anatolia and the Balkans. Sultan Mehmed II, known as Mehmed the Conqueror, was determined to complete the Ottoman conquest by taking Constantinople. In 1453, he assembled a massive army and navy to besiege the city. The siege lasted 53 days and featured some of the most advanced military technology of the time. The Ottomans used enormous cannons designed by a Hungarian engineer named Orban. These weapons could breach the massive walls that had protected Constantinople for over 1,000 years. The Byzantines, led by Emperor Constantine XI, fought courageously but were vastly outnumbered. The final assault came on May 29, 1453. Ottoman forces broke through the walls and poured into the city. Emperor Constantine XI died fighting on the walls, and the last Byzantine Empire came to an end. The great city was renamed Istanbul and became the capital of the Ottoman Empire. The fall of Constantinople sent shockwaves throughout Europe. Many saw it as the fulfillment of apocalyptic prophecies about the end of the Christian world. Greek scholars fled westward, bringing classical manuscripts and knowledge that enriched the Renaissance in Western Europe. The Ottoman conquest also changed the balance of power in Europe and the Mediterranean. The Ottomans controlled vital trade routes between Europe and Asia, forcing Europeans to seek new routes to the east. This economic pressure would contribute to the Age of Exploration and the discovery of the Americas. The 100 Years' War concludes. The final phase of the 100 Years' War saw the complete transformation of military technology and tactics. The war that had begun with mounted knights and longbows ended with cannons and professional armies, symbolizing the broader changes occurring throughout late medieval Europe. French recovery began in earnest after Joan of Arc's campaigns in 1420. The French developed new military technologies and tactics that proved superior to traditional English methods. Cannons made English-held fortifications vulnerable, while French improvements in logistics and organization gave them sustained advantages. The Bureau brothers, John and Gaspard, revolutionized French artillery in the 14th. Their standardized cannons and improved gunpowder made French forces devastatingly effective in siege warfare. English castles and fortified positions that had resisted traditional siege methods for months fell to cannon bombardment in days. The English position in France became increasingly untenable. They lacked the resources to match French military innovations while also dealing with internal political problems. The Wars of the Roses, which began in 1455, distracted English attention from French affairs and weakened royal authority. By 1453, the English had lost all their French territories except Calais. The Battle of Castillon in July 1453 marked the effective end of the 100 Years' War, though no formal peace treaty was signed. This battle demonstrated the dominance of gunpowder weapons over traditional medieval military methods. The war's end marked a crucial transition in European military history. The age of the mounted knight was ending, replaced by professional armies equipped with firearms. Feudal military service gave way to paid soldiers and centralized military organization. These changes would characterize early modern warfare. The Age of Exploration began. The 15th century witnessed the beginning of European overseas exploration that would eventually connect all inhabited continents in a global network of trade and cultural exchange. This expansion marked the definitive end of the medieval period and the beginning of the modern world system. Portuguese exploration began in the early 15th century under Prince Henry the Navigator, who established a school for navigation and sponsored voyages along the African coast. Portuguese sailors gradually pushed further south, learning to navigate the Atlantic winds and currents. The breakthrough came in 1488, when Bartolomeu Diaz rounded the Cape of Good Hope at the southern tip of Africa, proving that a sea route to Asia was possible. This discovery promised to break the Ottoman monopoly on trade between Europe and the East. Spanish exploration took a different direction after Christopher Columbus convinced Queen Isabella to sponsor his attempt to reach Asia by sailing west across the Atlantic. Columbus's voyage in 1492 brought Europeans into contact with the Americas for the first time since the Viking expeditions 5 centuries earlier. Columbus's discovery had consequences far beyond anything he imagined. The encounter between European and American civilizations would transform both continents. European diseases would devastate Native American populations, while American gold and silver would revolutionize the European economy. The success of these early voyages inspired further exploration. Vasco da Gama reached India by sailing around Africa in 1498. Spanish conquistadors explored and conquered vast territories in the Americas. Within a century, Europeans had established global trade networks and colonial empires. This expansion marked the definitive end of the medieval world. The self-contained European civilization of the Middle Ages was replaced by a global system in which Europe played the dominant role. The economic, cultural, and political consequences of this transformation would shape world history for centuries. The decline of feudalism. The social and economic system of feudalism, which had characterized medieval Europe for centuries, was in obvious decline by the 15th century. New forms of political organization, military technology, and economic activity were making feudal relationships obsolete. The rise of professional armies reduced the military importance of feudal knights. Monarchs preferred to hire soldiers who fought for pay, rather than rely on feudal levies who served for limited periods and often pursued their own interests. Gunpowder weapons made expensive knightly armor and training less relevant on the battlefield. Economic changes also undermined feudalism. The growth of trade and urban wealth created new sources of royal revenue that did not depend on feudal relationships. Monarchs could tax merchants and craftsmen rather than relying solely on feudal obligations from their vassals. The demographic catastrophes of the 14th century had accelerated social changes. Labor shortages after the Black Death strengthened the bargaining position of peasants and workers. Many serfs gained their freedom through purchase or negotiation. Others simply fled to towns where their labor was in demand. New forms of land tenure replaced feudal relationships. Monarchs granted land in exchange for monetary payments rather than military service. Professional administrators replaced feudal officials. Standing armies replaced feudal levies. These changes created more centralized and efficient government structures. By 1500, feudalism survived mainly as a legal fiction in most of Western Europe. While noble titles and some feudal ceremonies persisted, the actual political and economic relationships that had defined medieval society had largely disappeared. The transformation to early modern political and social systems was well advanced. The Church in transition. The Catholic Church of 1500 was dramatically different from the Church of 1000. The universal authority that the medieval papacy had claimed was gone, replaced by a more limited spiritual role in an increasingly secular world. The Western Schism had permanently damaged papal prestige. Even after the schism ended in 1417, the papacy never recovered the moral authority it had wielded during the High Middle Ages. National churches gained greater independence, and secular rulers exercised more control over religious affairs within their territories. The Renaissance papacy of the 15th century reflected these changes. Popes like Nicholas V and Sixtus IV were primarily concerned with artistic patronage, political affairs, and family advancement rather than spiritual leadership. The papacy became another Italian political power rather than a universal spiritual authority. Reform movements within the Church reflected widespread dissatisfaction with clerical corruption and worldliness. The Devotio Moderna movement in the Netherlands emphasized personal piety and individual religious experience. Similar movements throughout Europe called for return to earlier spiritual values. Intellectual challenges to church authority were also growing. Renaissance humanists studied scripture using the same critical methods they applied to classical texts. This scholarship revealed errors in traditional texts and raised questions about long-accepted doctrines and practices. The stage was being set for the Protestant Reformation that would split Western Christianity in the 16th century. The accumulated problems of the late medieval church, corruption, worldliness, intellectual challenges, and political weakness would soon explode into open revolt against papal authority. The transformation of daily life. Life for ordinary Europeans in 1500 differed significantly from life in 1000, though changes were gradual and often imperceptible to those experiencing them. The accumulated innovations of the medieval period had transformed material culture, social relationships, and worldviews. Agricultural techniques had improved substantially during the medieval period. The three-field system, heavy plows, horse collars, and selective breeding had increased food production. While famines still occurred, they were less frequent and severe than in earlier centuries. Urban life had been transformed by the revival of trade and craft production. Cities offered opportunities for social advancement that did not exist in rural areas. Guilds provided frameworks for economic activity and social organization that gave urban dwellers distinct identities and privileges. Technology had advanced in numerous areas. Watermills and windmills provided power for manufacturing. Mechanical clocks regulated urban life and work. Improvements in metallurgy produced better tools, weapons, and household goods. Navigation techniques enabled long-distance travel and trade. Education and literacy had expanded significantly, though they remained limited to a small minority of the population. Universities trained professionals in law, medicine, and theology. Cathedral schools and urban schools provided basic education to merchant families and craft workers. Family structures and gender roles had evolved throughout the medieval period. The nuclear family became more important relative to extended kinship networks. Women gained some legal and economic rights, though they remained subordinate to male authority in most areas of life. Religious life remained central to most people's experience, but it had changed considerably since 1000. Personal piety and individual religious experience became more important. Vernacular religious literature made spiritual knowledge more accessible to laypeople. Conclusion: the end of an era. As the 15th century drew to a close, the world that we call medieval was disappearing. The institutions, ideas, and social relationships that had characterized European civilization for nearly 1,000 years were being transformed or abandoned. The universal authorities of emperor and pope, which had dominated high medieval politics, had given way to national monarchies and territorial churches. The feudal system that had organized medieval society was being replaced by more centralized political structures and market-based economic relationships. The intellectual world was being revolutionized by the printing press, classical learning, and scientific inquiry. The self-contained European world was being shattered by overseas exploration and the discovery of new continents and civilizations. Yet continuities persisted alongside these dramatic changes. Christianity remained the dominant cultural force throughout Europe. Agricultural production continued to be the foundation of economic life for most people. Social hierarchies, though modified, remained fundamental to European civilization. The medieval period had witnessed remarkable achievements: the preservation of classical learning, the construction of magnificent cathedrals, the development of universities, the creation of vernacular literatures, and the establishment of legal and political institutions that would influence European development for centuries. Medieval Europe had also experienced tremendous suffering, devastating plagues, destructive wars, religious persecution, and grinding poverty for the majority of the population. The medieval world was one of both extraordinary creativity and terrible hardship. As Europe entered the 16th century, it was poised for even greater transformations. The Protestant Reformation would divide Western Christianity. The scientific revolution would challenge fundamental assumptions about the natural world. The discovery and exploitation of the Americas would create the first global economy. The medieval period had ended, but its legacy would continue to influence European civilization for centuries to come. The languages, laws, institutions, and cultural traditions established during the Middle Ages provided the foundation upon which the modern world would be built. This long journey through medieval history reveals the complexity and richness of a civilization that was neither dark nor simple, but rather dynamic and sophisticated in its own distinctive ways. The medieval world deserves to be remembered not as a prelude to something better, but as a remarkable civilization that made its own unique contributions to human achievement.